Good afternoon, and thank you for participating in today's event. My name is Nadia Tunstall, and I will be your moderator. This presentation is brought to you by OJJDP's Missing and Exploited Children's Program, also known as MECP. MECP is a training and technical assistance program that supports states, tribal communities, local governments, and both public and private organizations in their efforts to protect children and respond to child abduction and sexual exploitation. Fox Valley Technical College's National Criminal Justice Training Center is responsible for the provision of training and technical assistance services for MECP, as well as a number of training and technical assistance programs for the Department of Justice. A link to this information may be found at the website located on the bottom of your screen, which is www.mecptraining.org. Today's presentation was designed specifically with you in mind. Following December's webinar on recognizing the signs of child sexual abuse, we received a number of inquiries regarding the next phase in reporting sexual abuse. MECP has partnered with the National Children's Alliance for today's presentation. Today's panelists include Jane Braun of the Midwest Regional Children's Advocacy Center and Sergeant Dave Betts of the Harford County Sheriff's Office in Maryland. Thank you for joining us today, Jane and Dave. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. For audio support, please see the audio box on your screen and use the telephone or your mic and speakers. You can check the audio setup box for problems. All callers will be on mute throughout the webinar. To ask a question, please see the questions box. You may type your question in the box and click send. Staff will respond to you in the questions box as well. There will be a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's event. I will now turn it over to Jane for an introduction. Jane?
Thank you, Nadia. As Nadia mentioned, the previous webinar covered possible signs of abuse, and today we want to continue along on that theme and talk about the issues involved in actually making the child abuse report, whether to Child Protection Services or to law enforcement. And Dave and I will try to address when it's appropriate to make a report, who to make it to, and what we look for in a report. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the required reporters. I have to beg your indulgence because, as you know, in the United States, every state is actually a little different, and who they determine are mandated reporters and when and if you even have to report. So Dave and I will try to address what we believe the majority of the states have, but you would have to take a look online at your own state requirements as to who is to report and what they report. Like I said, there's a core theme in all of this, but there can be what I'd call glitchy differences by state. Required reporters in general are people who work in human services in some field. The core field of delivered services by social workers, teachers, school principals, preschool teachers, counselors at schools, teachers' aides, school bus drivers, physicians, other healthcare workers, mental health professionals, child care and preschool providers, medical examiners or coroners, and of course law enforcement officers. Some states actually have a division where Child Protective Service workers are mandated reporters 24 hours, whereas other social workers are mandated only on their jobs. But my feeling is that it's always better to be safe rather than sorry, and you should always try and make the report, period, and worry about whether it's you are a mandated reporter or not after you make the call. Dave?
Yeah, I would even take that a little bit further with that off-duty status, especially, Jane. If the person knows that you are one of these required reporters, one of these workers, whether you're off-duty or not, they're coming to you because you're one of these workers. So that is, I think that is definitely that fine line. Now, these are where these listed on the slide are the general required reporters throughout the United States. You're probably not going to see a whole lot of change in that. But if you look at the next slide, and we look at some of the additional required reporting that's throughout the United States, and this was from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So I would actually get on there and see if your state is actually one of these. But commercial film and photographers or processors, 11 states require them. Now, as far as law enforcement, what I've seen, this was probably really more so in the early 2000s when we started seeing a lot of processing, like at your convenience stores, your Rite Aid, your CVS, the drug stores, where they were processing a lot. Now a lot of it is you can either do it yourself or it's all digital. But I've had countless cases where we were called because somebody had brought something inappropriate to one of these processing agencies. So 11 states require those. Substance abuse counselors, you have 14 states, parole and probation, 17 states, domestic violence workers, 7 states and the District of Columbia, animal control or humane officers, 7 states and District of Columbia as well. Now some of you may say, well, why animal control or humane officers? I would say there's a lot of correlation, and you can read out, there's a lot of studies on this about the correlation between animal abuse and abuse of a child. And I think it's important if you can get this type of worker in your jurisdiction to have that kind of dialogue with you. There's a lot of intel or a lot of intelligence and information that they have from going out to these houses that maybe law enforcement and social services may not go out to. So there's good information there. Your court-appointed special advocates, 9 states, clergy, 26 states, and you really have to look at how that's defined in those 26 states. And then any person who suspects or believes a child is being abused or neglected, 18 states. So it doesn't matter who you are or what your status is. In those 18 states, it's any person, which really, if we had a wish list, that's where we'd go, any person who believes. Jane, you have anything to add on that?
No. Again, I guess I always tell people when I go out and do trainings about reporting to child protection, I say when in doubt, dial the phone, period. I don't care if you're mandated or not, dial the phone. But that brings us up to why people don't report, and there's a myriad of reasons why they don't. A lot of times it's a lack of understanding or knowledge of signs of abuse, or people have been so used to seeing something occurring around them that to them they don't translate that to abuse that's everyday functioning, or they don't know who to call to make a report. And a lot of times we get calls from folks who are apologizing the minute they connect with you as though they're sorry for taking your time. And that's a shame, because the reason we're here is to try and provide services to people and to try and help people work through this. And that's the job of the screeners and for child protection and the dispatchers for the police, is to try to calm anybody who calls and elicit the information that we need to see just if we can help and how we can help. People, I think, fear retaliation. If anybody's ever made a call to the police or anyone to report anything, not just Child Protective Services, I think there's always an underlying aspect of what is that retaliation going to be. Even though I will say that in my 35 years of working in this field, I can tell you that the retaliation usually is more the fear of rather than an actual occurrence after a report, and we'll talk about that later. They may think it's a breach of confidentiality. Sometimes professionals don't want to do it. They don't want to wreck the relationship with the patient, with the client. And they feel that they are not comfortable with giving this information to an outside party, regardless of whether they're mandated reporters or not. And the next one is huge, and that's the past experience of reporting and lack of action. Some people become frustrated when, quotes, nothing is done, unquotes, after they have made a call, and so they give up before they dial that phone again. And to that end, and we'll talk about this later, it is a process. And very oftentimes I would say the one call may not elicit what you want, but it's the start in the process to get help for people. And we'll talk about that later. Some people just don't want to get involved. This is the person perhaps that's in a parking lot of a grocery store and sees someone really hitting their child. Or it's a family member who says, I just want nothing to do with this. I'm just getting away from it. Or people are uncomfortable to report. Some people have a very difficult time saying words like penis or breast or something like that, or talking about sexual acts. And it's just overwhelming to them to have to dial a phone and discuss that with someone. And I think there can be an element of denial, certainly with family members, that there's anything even wrong. People can be very involved in an action and just say, no, it really isn't what people think it is. This is really a nothing experience. And I can give an example of that later too. But Dave, do you have anything?
No, I think, and again, we'll talk a little bit this in some other slides, but I agree with you about the retaliation where in 14 years investigating this, I have not seen that. And so I can understand that there is that fear that's a perception and not a reality, so to speak. And then a lot of other these as well as we don't go around telling everybody what has happened in the case. So sometimes people think that things don't happen, and where in reality it is. So as we go into this a little bit deeper, I think it's more of a perception rather than a reality on some of these issues. So let's discuss how to report. And if we go to the next slide and we look at report, how we're going to actually report. And the majority of states are going to cross-report. If it's an abuse case, it's going to go to both law enforcement and CPS. If you desire to contact law enforcement rather than CPS, that's fine. If you rather CPS, law enforcement, that's fine as well. I think that most professionals around the United States are going to say, just report it. We don't care how it gets there. Some states, not all of them, will have that you have to report to CPS. For instance, if we get a call in law enforcement here in Maryland, we're going to contact CPS. That's something I make sure that in every report, once that comes in, that CPS is contacted, even though we're co-located and they sit right next to us. So, but you have to do that. Reporting guidelines, there's a lot of information for your state online. The technology nowadays is beautiful, the fact that there's so much information, and it will direct you what they're looking for and how to report that. Now here's where I say if it's an immediate issue, or even if it's not an immediate issue, and CPS is usually open from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Most law enforcement agencies are open 24/7 unless you get into some smaller jurisdictions. But there is going to be a law enforcement agency that covers everywhere 24/7 in the United States. When in doubt, call. And that's the bottom line, is if CPS, if it's after 5 o'clock, call law enforcement. Somebody's going to respond. And the dispatcher is going to ask certain information, different information other than CPS, but somebody's going to respond. And then again, when in doubt, 911. 911 is throughout the country. If you call 911, somebody's going to respond. Somebody's going to talk to you. And there's usually the non-emergency listed numbers as well. And it really depends on the jurisdiction. I can't say, 911 is you just call for everything, because it really does vary throughout the country. But screeners, and maybe Jane, you'll talk a little bit more about this when we get on the next slide, but screeners weigh the call by risk to the child. So what we're looking for is when that comes in, is there an immediate issue? And I will tell you for detectives, what I'm looking for is the child presenting at a hospital, and is there contact with the suspect or the perpetrator? And it's, of course, first and foremost, is there anything life-threatening? And those are the three things as an investigator that I would look for as an immediacy. And, of course, there's some other things as well. At the end, you'll see we'll have some resources that we'll go over for you as well. There's a lot online. Don't hesitate for a minute to get on and start looking, and you know, knowledge is powerful, and it pays to do that research.
And I think the thing I'd add to that, Dave, is that while most Child Protective Service agencies are open 8 to 5, most of them have after-hours coverage on a crisis line that someone can call in and ask questions on. However, I will say that the bulk of those lines do not have child protection workers available to go out in the evening or on the weekends. And if it's, and I'm weighing the risk, just as Dave mentioned, I'm always going to say call the police right away, or I will, because we want someone to go out and do a health and safety check right away, and CPS is not going to be the one to do that after hours.
And I think that, you know, as time, or as this evolves, you know, and child abuse is becoming more aware, there's a lot of training in the law enforcement community where if it's an issue that law enforcement needs to respond, they're trained in what to do and what not to do. And I would encourage, the general public to call at any point, whether it's CPS or law enforcement.
Okay.
So let's move on to, go ahead, Jane, go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Reporter information. We have mandated reporter calls and non-mandated reporter calls. And I will tell you that mandated reporters are so valued by CPS because these calls are usually have no bias, interpretive or emotionally driven basis to them. They're factual, because the people out in the field, the mandated reporters, are out in the field when child protection is not, and they're usually advocates. All of those mandated reporter categories that we listed in that first slide, these are people out in the field who are child advocates. They have virtually daily contact with children and know these children pretty well. So CPS truly values these callers because these are the folks that we can work with to try and develop a case if, in fact, there's not enough information at the front end of the call. Anytime we open a case in Child Protective Services, it's got to be based on specific information. A knowledge of an abuse or neglect, injuries, or someone can really articulate that neglect. We will not do it because you think something is odd, because children are never allowed to play outside their house, or children are outside all the time and they're not allowed in their house for much time. For rather vague issues like that, we're not going to get truly excited about opening a case. I think you always have to take it a step further and think, put yourself in the place of the child protection worker who goes out to that home. That worker under law is required to knock on the door, say who he or she is, and give the specific reason why they're there. And they can't go there and say, well, people are just concerned about your family. Concerned in what way? We have to give an issue. So that specific information, again, has to have been given that worker so that when he or she goes to the door to tell that family that they would like to talk to them, it's about an issue. We do accept anonymous reports. However, I can tell you that the screeners will sit longer on that phone call with that person trying to determine how they got the information they got and what their relationship is to the people that they're reporting on. Oftentimes calls from anonymous reporters are driven by issues of retaliation, wanting to get even for something that they perceive that happened, and oftentimes these calls are by people giving us information that's old information because they've kind of sandbagged it. They've let it weigh and play out for quite some time before they've called in. A screener will spend a lot of time trying to determine what the motivator is for the report, if it's truly a concern for the child, or if it's built on something else. Mandated reporters usually are not allowed to report anonymously. So they can't meet the law as a mandated reporter by doing it anonymously. So if you're a mandated reporter, you've got to own up to it at the get-go. Now you can, a mandated reporter could call in and say, I just want to run something by you, screeners, to see whether you think this would rise to the level of being a mandated report, and we're fine with doing that. We're not going to force a person to give us a name before we even get going on a report, so we're okay with that. We generally, across the bulk of the United States, do not take hearsay reports. However, if someone says, I got some information from a neighbor about something that they saw and I thought you ought to know, I will really appreciate that call. Try to get as much information as I can from the reporter about this second-hand report, and if it's at all possible, I will then work my way back to try and find the original reporter, or I will try to find the school, if there is one that the child is at, to try and get accurate information that way. But otherwise, we are as obligated to protect the families ourselves by having good, accurate, fair reports when we go out to address them. I can assure you, many people think that by calling Child Protection and sending out a child protection worker, we will, quote, scare the family into doing the right thing, and that does not work. If a social worker goes out on a weak, inaccurate report, all we have wound up doing generally is empowering a possible perpetrator, because we will knock on the door, have no fuel to really address with the family, or find out that it's not the truth right away, in which case we turn around, walk away, and that leaves what could be a perpetrator or an offender in a power position from that child's aspect, because that child is still there with that offender and we've walked away. So I think people have to understand that Child Protective Services is going to spend a lot of time getting as accurate an informational base as we possibly can to give the worker that we're sending out to a home. Dave?
No, I think that's good information. If we go to the next slide, I'll go a little bit more into this as well, where as the caller calls, there's some information that obviously we really need to have, but their job is not to investigate this case prior to making that call, meaning that the abuser need not be known to the reporter. Now, most of the time, the reporter's going to know who the abuser is, but we don't want anyone investigating this case further just to get that information in order to give it to a screener or a law enforcement officer. So that not need be a piece of the report. Now, the do not investigate, rather listen or observe what the child is saying. This really goes not only to the reporter, but to everybody out there that perhaps wouldn't be a forensic interviewer and or an investigator. And why I say that is we don't, and I would have a very hard time as a parent as well, if my child came to me and there was an abuse, you want to know it's human characteristic to say, hey, tell me more, we want to be able to fix it. But we don't want that to happen. We'd much rather have somebody, just listen to that child. We don't want the investigation. We don't want more of that disclosure. Disclosure is going to be a process. It's not an event. So that all that's happening right there is not, just listen to that child and observe what's going on with that child. Observation is a key to the investigation, whether CPS, law enforcement, as we're doing this together. The caller does not have to prove the abuse is occurring. Mere fact that we believe that a case or an abuse or neglect is occurring, that's when that call should be made. Suspect or suspicion of that abuse or neglect. Don't have to prove it. The screener, when they call in, that screener is going to be responsible for knowing the law and the county interpretation. So there doesn't have to be a big research on, well, does this meet the criteria for the law? We'll figure all that out in the investigation and as the screener talks. The screener is going to know what to ask because of what the law says in that county or jurisdiction. they're going to ask the right questions. Not a whole lot of research and or investigation should go into that before making that call. And really, the screeners are those gatekeepers. Their job is to build that solid case for assignment, meaning get that information. They're the independent fact finder on the phone and investigator on the phone talking to that reporter. It is rather difficult if it is a hearsay case because we need that information. And we'll get into as far as the reporter and talking to them through about the investigation as well. But this, just in calling that, there not need be this huge case presented to the screener when that caller calls. Does that make sense? Am I saying that right, Jane?
Yes.
Okay.
We don't expect people to know the law. We don't expect people to know that what they're reporting we would interpret as grievous or not. All we're saying is call and let us walk through this with you, and we'll try between us to determine what we've got and what action can be taken. I can kind of give you an example, I think, on a neglect case. Let's say a school called in and said, you know, we've got a little child here, he's 6 years old, he comes in, and every day he comes to school, we have to take his backpack from him, and we have to take cockroaches out of his backpack and his pockets. And is this a child abuse report, a child protection report? At that point, we would say no. It's unfortunate, but you should deal with the parents about trying to deal with a cockroach problem at home that's occurring at school. And the school was frustrated because they didn't like the worry of having cockroaches in the school and having to do this every day. However, I said to the reporter, you know, I understand your frustration with this, but I'll tell you what would make it a case for me. If this child is being bullied or manipulated by other children because they see this and they're making fun of him and it's impacting the child's ability to attend school, we would take it because we have a negative outcome to that child from the issue of having these cockroaches. And so the school counselor said, yeah, okay, let me check around because I can't answer that question right now. And they called me back the next day and said, well, we think we have it because this child comes to school and spends 45 minutes a day, almost daily, asleep at his desk because he said that he's afraid to fall asleep at night because his mouth falls open and a cockroach will come in to his mouth. That easily is a child protection report at that point. So we built that case, even though the school as an advocate so badly wanted this case to be taken immediately, child protection could not. But with us working together, we built a case that we could take it within 24 hours, which was great. And that happens very, very often. So that's a luxury of developing a relationship and being comfortable in calling the screener and asking the question. If the screener says, you know, this really doesn't rise to the level of a report for us, the reporter should say, what would it take additionally to make this a report? Can you explain this to me? And of course the screener would. The screener should be happy to do that. We have to work as a team because the screener wants to build the case. We want to take cases. We're gatekeepers, but in that sense, we're not gatekeepers to try and keep people from coming into child protection. We're just trying to build accurate, adequate cases to take action on. With that, I'll go to the next slide. What are we looking for? Well, obviously, if a case is high risk, as Dave had mentioned earlier, if a child is going home to a situation that we are relatively sure there would be physical or sexual abuse, that's high risk and we would take immediate action. Another one is how chronic is the issue. This is more often true of neglect cases. How chronic is it? How serious is it? And how is it played out over time? Pain level. Obviously, if there's it's it's a physical abuse issue or the child has a medical condition that is leading to pain and nothing is being done, obviously that's an immediacy that we've got to do something right away about. Possible permanent damage. People can elect not to provide medical cares for their children. However, if there is a possible outcome that could mean permanent damage to that child or some serious harm, then we would definitely pick up that case. But we would have to talk to the reporter about that. Failure to thrive always is a child who is malnourished, underweight, whether that child is an infant or a school-age child, we will take that case. As soon as we can determine that that child is in a low percentile for growth. The caregiver is unwilling or unable to provide necessary cares for a child. Now, a lot of times I use school as an example for this because oftentimes, or preschool, oftentimes child protection will get called with calls about she's not wearing socks and it's winter time. And the first words the screener will say is, have you addressed this issue with the parent? Have you asked the parent? For example, if you have people from another country who have moved to Minnesota and it's 20 below and they're wearing sandals to school or something, you have to ask the question, has anyone told this family about the dangers of frostbite, the dangers of cold weather, and told them what it takes to resolve this? If a caregiver is unwilling to provide those types of cares in that situation, then Child Protective Services would become active. But we also become active when a parent honestly cannot provide a service. For example, if a parent is homeless and can't provide shelter for a child, and this has been an ongoing issue, then Child Protection may have to step in as well. Dave, do you have any more on that?
No, I did want to say something though about our previous couple slides when we were talking about reporting, and it may not rise to the level of an investigation, but quite often, and would you not agree, Jane, that quite often we see some of the same kids that, or the same kids are reported on, and that information, all that together can sometimes build that case.
Absolutely, Dave. I'm glad that you mentioned that because that's exactly what screeners do. We sit on a computer all day, every day, and if we are alarmed about a child or have heard multiple different reports, we will try to put them together to make a case. So yes, even if someone only has a bit of information, actually the screeners may well be sitting on some other information and they just may need your piece to actually have the case. So case building is huge for our purposes, and it can come from a myriad of sources, and putting it all together allows us to go out, very definitely.
And it's really just like putting together a puzzle, and it's once you get all those pieces, then you have that puzzle and you have that case.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's go to the next one. Let's talk a little bit about what happens after a report is made. And I know the last webinar discussed some investigation issues, but I'll go into just a little bit on the surface of that and kind of recap that. But all reporters are to report to CPS and law enforcement within 24 hours of suspicion. And I would probably make the argument that 24 hours is a long time, and a lot of things can happen within 24 hours. If you realize the child is being abused or neglected, I would make the argument to report that immediately. The delays harm the integrity of the report. I would never discourage anyone from making a report at any time, but it really does impact the investigation if there is a delay in the report. It doesn't protect the child, and it really can harm the subsequent investigation. And how that happens, after a report's made, law enforcement and CPS are going to confer, and we're going to share the information and know what's going on with this family. And obviously, if the child is in immediate danger, we're going to immediately see that child and remove them from that danger, whatever it may be. But we know that there's not a lot of physical evidence in sexual abuse cases. Now, obviously, physical abuse cases presents as an injury there. But in sexual abuse cases, there's not a lot of physical evidence. The longer that a report is delayed, the harder it is to gain that physical evidence. Primarily, we want to look at what is in the best interest of that child. And I say that to every time I go out and I instruct anywhere, it's what's in the best interest of that child. Not what's in the best interest of the reporter or the parents or school or the police or social workers, whatever it may be. What's in the best interest of that child? And the best interest of that child is to start getting that intervention as soon as possible. Then we can start to be building that case together. If that abuse goes on, or there's that suspicion of maybe that child is being abused by a caretaker, and that caretaker finds out, it's even more difficult for law enforcement, because we want that element of surprise. We want to be able to get to that person before he or she knows that that investigation is going on. So the sooner that information is given to law enforcement or CPS, the better it's going to be for protecting that child. It's imperative that information, and as much information, comes from the reporter and any other collateral witness that we can get from them. Jane, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to add to that, Dave, that for anywhere in the country, it's clear that corporal punishment of children is allowed. But within that, while you can strike children to punish them, you cannot injure children in that. And then injury, I'm thinking of cut, scratch, bruise, anything that's swelling that you can see. Oftentimes people do not report these until the injury is either no longer there, or it and wasn't seen by anybody that can help us. If there is no current injury, it makes it extremely difficult for child protection and law enforcement to proceed. We have no evidence. And taking a picture yourself of an injury and subsequently months later reporting it is not going to be of value either, because of the questionable picture and what it might be showing is not going to hold weight for prosecution. Usually we say if there's a child with an injury, that child should be either immediately brought to a hospital where the hospital will take the photograph, or law enforcement should be called out to take the photograph, or child protection should be called to immediately send out a social worker to see the injury. To help a child, we also need to try and have proofs beyond the child's word. And so timeliness is incredibly important on physical abuse and sexual abuse. Neglect tends to be more chronic, and you have more time in dealing with it. But for both physical and sexual abuse, it really should be as quickly as people find out about it.
And we may have covered a little bit of the things that we're going to cover in the next slide, but maybe we can go a little bit more in depth with that one, Jane, if you can. We could do the next slide.
Okay. So once the report is received, what's going to happen? There has to be an initial assessment. Law enforcement or CPS or both together are going to come up with a plan of action. They're going to immediately try to contact the child and the non-offending caregiver if that's possible. In the case of the non-offending caregiver, for example, let's say there is an allegation that a child is saying that the stepfather or mother's boyfriend is threatening to do something sexual to them or viewing them in the shower or something like that. It would seem apparent that the non-offending caregiver would be the mother in that case. However, if the child subsequently says to us, well, I've told my mom about this a couple of times, and she calls me a liar, or she tells me to get over it. She's just kidding me. Then we have another issue altogether. We don't have a non-offending caregiver, and child protection and with law enforcement are going to probably have to step in and remove that child until we can determine what would be a safe home for that child. And there needs to be a 2 or 3 day fact gathering session for us and family contact session to try and determine if mother can turn around and see this for what it is, which certainly is threatening to that child, and if she will file an order for protection, and if she will be responsible for her child going forward. So neglect cases, though, are different. In looking at a neglect case, these are generally slower moving because there's no usual immediate threat. This is ongoing things like a child continuously missing school, filthy houses that aren't so bad that they're being evicted necessarily, but children who are coming to school filthy and being bullied by other kids about this and teased. These cases involve a lot of time and effort on the part of Child Protective Services to take the time to work through with the family at alleviating whatever the issues are. The federal government is always clear in saying to child protection, you've got to try to keep children with their blood relatives, with their families, and give the parents, not intentionally offending caregivers, opportunities to turn things around to keep the child safe and keep the family together. The safety of the children is always going to be our first priority. And in physical and sexual abuse cases, we can act and do act swiftly with law enforcement if need be to remove children from homes, again, hopefully for a shorter period of time till we can stabilize it for the child, or failing that, find other blood relatives for a child to be with. People's perceptions that children are spirited away, not to come home again, not to come back to family is very, very incorrect, and very, very rarely does happen. Medical treatment, if it's needed, has to be gotten as quickly as possible, and both child protection and law enforcement know right where to go with these kids to get them the care that they need. Usually we have emergency rooms that we primarily report to with kids who need this medical treatment right away, and hopefully can access records to see if there's been any history for this child. Forensic interviews are obtained, which are interviews of children in neutral settings at children's advocacy centers around the country, where a very skilled interviewer sits down with the child in a very child-friendly place and talks to the child about what's happened to the child to date. It's usually a comfortable interview. It's usually not too painful. Children feel safe there, and the information in the interview is usually given immediately to law enforcement and CPS. They're usually standing right there watching the interview from another room, or it is immediately conveyed to them, failing their being able to attend. And they gather this information and evidence, if there is evidence, and make a joint decision on what should happen next. CPS will either determine maltreatment or substantiate maltreatment or not. Law enforcement, through their investigation, will present it to prosecutors to see if they want to go forward on a court case or not. It's not our decision. We always have to either show up in family court or criminal court, and while we may make findings, the ultimate decision maker is going to be the court. Dave?
I think one of the things I just wanted to really reiterate, as you talked about the gathering of evidence, that is really done together, because quite often you have that territorial issues, but in these kind of cases, CPS and law enforcement work really well together and gather all of that evidence together, because more so, the two heads are better than one. And that, I think, works well. And that's why that Child Advocacy Center model has grown substantially over the last 20 years. And that's what that whole idea is behind it. But if I don't have anything else on this one, Jane. Are you good on this one?
Yeah, I'm fine. We can push forward.
So let's just, as a wrap-up, let's just go over a couple myths. And I wanted to touch on these just so that we hear these things quite often, and we talked about these a little bit in the first couple slides. But the reporter's name is always provided to the investigative family, and that is not accurate at all. We do not disclose reporters' names. As far as law enforcement, I will tell you that it helps to have the reporter's name, because that reporter has a lot of good information, and that will help us steer in the right direction of the investigation. But the reporter's name is not provided to the family. Retaliation is common when making a report. We've already discussed it, that indeed is not the case. I have not seen it. And Jane, you said in 35 years you've never seen something like this?
The only retaliation I ever saw was usually between parents and grandparents. If the grandparents reported, the parents figured that out and would try to withhold the child from the grandparents. Did I ever see anyone else really go after a parent? I would say no, because we try to diffuse that when we come out. We say it's not important, and it isn't. We say we're here to try and help you and help your child. That's what's important. If you care about your child, you'll listen to me. We'll work through this together, and we pretty much just push to the side how we got the information to get there. And that's true for mandated reporters too, truly.
That is a good point. We're going on the basis that we have a report. We still have to prove that a case is happening or an incident is occurring. We're not going by on that just that reporters say so. So there is not a necessity to divulge that anyway. So, and the retaliation just is more of a perception that could happen than a reality. It's not going to happen. I will be updated on the case progress as time allows. Probably not, only because there is a lot of factors that go into this in the investigation. Now, CPS has specific mandated times that they have to have their report done within, usually 30 to 60 days, depending on where you're at in the country. Law enforcement, we have as long as it usually takes. And if there's DNA involved, it could take upwards of 6 months. That's just reality, unfortunately. Children are often removed from the home during an investigation. That does not occur. And I will tell you, I have seen over the last 20-some years is that I think that there's more of a plan for reunification and making sure that the family stays together than this. Would you not agree, Jane? I mean, we don't want...
Absolutely. If a child is removed from a home, generally speaking, that child will be home within a couple of days, because in that time we would have determined accuracy of the report, figure out a safety net for that child. We want that child with their blood relatives, period. The federal government makes it very clear that's where they are to be, and that is what we have to try and do.
And that really is the best for the child. And the next is I can be sued for making a good faith report. Not if you're making a good faith report. If somebody truly believes that there is an incident going on with a child, you will not be sued. Now, if there's a false report, then that's obviously different. But a good faith report, no. I shouldn't report the abuse if it didn't just happen. No, you should report the abuse if you thought it happened 5 years ago, 4 years ago, or 2 hours ago. Report the abuse. It does not matter. And I can be active in the investigation to help interview the child. No. Obviously, we've been trained. The professionals have been trained in this. I have often asked family or collateral witnesses for additional information in the investigation, but as far as investigating and interviewing the child, no. At a minimum, most forensic interviewers have been trained at least 40 hours. So most others don't have that kind of training. And there's a reason for that. We want the professionals to do this. And then cases are solved in an hour. How I wish, because then we'd actually not have the caseload that most of us have. But no, they're not solved in an hour. Some are solved quicker than others, but then again, some do take quite a while because of that evidence gathering and evidence analysis. So no, unfortunately, they're not solved in an hour, and I have to chuckle when I watch TV sometimes, and I think, wow, they're really good. They can do that within that time frame. But it doesn't happen. It's just not going to happen that way. Jane, any other myths you can think of?
No, I think that's about it, Dave. What I would say is when in doubt, call. No question, no statement do we feel is too silly or inadequate enough to have a discussion about. That's why we sit there, is we want people to call us. So be comfortable in encouraging people to call if they have information. Don't have a expectation of what you think is going to happen as an outcome. Just be open to what we can do with you and for you once you dial that phone.
I agree. I think that's one thing if you leave with, it's call. So, very good.
Thank you, Jane and Dave. Again, this is Nadia Tunstall, and we are going to proceed to the Q&A portion. I'd ask that you continue to submit your questions through your questions box. But before that, I wanted to go over some resources. We had a number of questions come in on state law. If you'll notice, the last three bullets on your screen link to some information for state reporting agencies by your state, as well as the mandatory reporting laws. As Jane and Dave mentioned, the laws do vary state by state, so I encourage you to check out this information. Also, the first bullet includes some information on how to report suspected child maltreatment, including child sexual abuse. So please check out those resources, and we'll leave them on the screen during the Q&A portion. The first question is, of course, what are the resources for families or reporters when Child Protective Services or law enforcement has not followed up or actively pursued allegations? And I think, Jane and Dave, you've done a great job in talking about the process for screening as well as investigating allegations of child sexual abuse and maltreatment. But what are the resources out there if families and reporters feel like that's not enough?
Well, as far as for law enforcement, every law enforcement department has a chain of command. So if you think that the services are being provided that is due to that case, then I would suggest, looking at contacting maybe one of the administrators in that department. If that does not work, every criminal case is going to go through a prosecutor or a prosecution office. And that's where I would really turn as far, if you're not getting the answers, and most of the time it just boils down to a lack of communication. And unfortunately, I mean, it does happen. But that's where I would start as far as if it's a law enforcement issue.
For Child Protective Services, I would say there's usually a lead screener you can talk to. There's a supervisor of the screeners that you can talk to. There's a department manager, and there's the Director of Human Services. If you don't feel that you're getting justice that route, you could certainly go to the State Department of Human Services, which is an oversight agency of the county and parish social service departments. And they too have a child protective division. They do not investigate cases out in the field, but they can go to the county and ask what has actually occurred. And what's going on. County offices also have boards of directors, and those are elected officials who oversight the county social services as well. So you could certainly go to your representative and complain that way too. And some people go to Congress and report to their senators or their representatives about what they feel is an injustice. That could happen too.
All right. Well, thank you for that information. This question presents itself first as a scenario, and it goes back to the gray areas in reporting child sexual abuse, especially when there is very little evidence and maybe some secondhand knowledge. What if you're unsure whether the act classifies as child sexual abuse, and what's the recommended course of action? And I'll give you some background. This is the scenario that was presented by one of the participants. There's a 17-year-old who may be engaging in an inappropriate relationship with an older adult, but the parent has not reported this relationship. The participant suspects that it might be inappropriate and constitute as child sexual abuse. So what would be the recommended course of action for scenarios such as this?
Well, I think that, first of all, the mere fact that somebody is unsure is at a point where it's risen to the level of, well, I know for sure nothing's happening. Now I'm unsure, or I know that there's something happening. So if you've risen to the level of unsure, then I would say make that phone call. Now, there's also the issue of 17-year-old is, depending on the state, the age of consent. Most of the states are 16. Now, there's also the issue of does it rise to the level of is it an abuse, meaning is there a care and custody issue here? So that's a lot of information that caller doesn't have to have. But if it's risen to the level of I'm unsure, that's when the call should be made.
And the other issue with that as well would be what the relationship is of that older person. Was that person a teacher?
Right.
Was that person a minister? Was that person a counselor somewhere? It's very, very important. As Dave said, with a 17-year-old, it can be a grayer area on, depending on the age of the male, as to whether it's going to require an investigation. But the relationship issue could spring it into an immediate investigation very easily. Caller doesn't have to know all that. We just dial the phone and talk to us about it.
And I would much rather have that person call and give us that scenario and let us look at, what is that relationship, like Jane said, and what's the law in regards to that. It may not be a case, but if it is and nothing's done, then that 17-year-old is habitually engaging in a harmful activity.
All right. Well, thank you both for that information. We have time for just one more question, and this one will be short. It's another scenario. One participant has indicated that they do work with adult survivors of child sexual abuse. In the event that that adult survivor has indicated that their abuser works with children, maybe a teacher or working in a child serving organization, is that reportable, and to whom?
Well, go ahead, Jane. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dave.
Well, I would say, again, it's going to depend on your state. But I will tell you, in Maryland, it does not say when the abuse occurred, so that would be a reportable offense here. And our service providers do report adult survivors. Now, that doesn't mean, I will tell you that if that adult doesn't want that investigation to occur, then it normally won't, if that makes sense. But I would also encourage, if that perpetrator is now working with kids, that's a huge red flag. And I would encourage the counselor, whoever it may be, along with the victim, to make that call. Jane?
I agree, Dave. That's what I would say, too. It will depend on what type of sexual abuse occurred, how old this woman was at the point in time that it happened, who's the group that he's working with now, was there anyone else involved that the reporter is known about that could have been abused by this individual as well. That would be something that would certainly be developed by both law enforcement and child protection.
Thank you. As I mentioned, we are cutting close to the end of today's event. I would first like to thank you, Jane and Dave, for your wonderful presentation and all of the information you've shared with us today. And thank you to our audience for your questions and your attentiveness. Before we close, I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. One, At the conclusion of today's event, there will be an evaluation. We ask that you complete that evaluation, and there will be an option at the very bottom of the form to submit additional questions. Also, I encourage you to send us an email at MECPtraining@Fox Valley Technical College, which is fvtc.edu, for any remaining questions that you may have. You may also visit our website at www.mecptraining.org for more information on the recorded presentation, resources, and our training and technical assistance program. And I hope that you would join us next month for the next webinar in the series on child sexual abuse. So thank you again for joining us today, and please send us an email or complete the evaluation for opportunities to submit additional questions. Thank you.